Hello everyone, welcome to the progress. So here we are progressing daily by being consistent and reading regularly. So I hope you are very consistent and now we are back so we will continue without wasting any of the minutes. So we will start from where we left and the last part was really interesting. So let's continue. I ran back to my hut to collect all my possessions my food bowl, a pair of torn mittens inherited from a dead typhus patient, and a few scraps of paper covered with shorthand notes on which, as I mentioned before, I had started to reconstruct the manuscript which I lost at Auschwitz. I made a quick last round of my patients, who were lying huddled on the rotten planks of wood on either side of the huts. I came to my only countryman who was almost dying, and whose life it had been my ambition to save in spite of his condition. I had to keep my intention to escape to myself, but my comrade seemed to guess that something was wrong. Perhaps I showed a little nervousness. In a tired voice, he asked me, "You too are getting out?" I denied it, but I found it difficult to avoid his sad look. After my round, I returned to him. Again, a hopeless look greeted me, and somehow I felt it to be an accusation. The unpleasant feeling that had gripped me as soon as I had told my friend I would escape with him became more intense. Suddenly, I decided to take fate into my own hands for once. I ran out of my hut and told my friend that I could not go with him. As soon as I had told him with finality that I made up my mind to stay with my patients, the unhappy feelings left me. I did not know what the following days would bring, but I gained an inward peace that I had never experienced before. I returned to the hut, sat down on the boards at my countryman's feet, and tried to comfort him. Then chatted with the others, trying to quiet them in their delirium. Our last day in the camp arrived. As the battlefront came nearer, mass transport had taken nearly all the prisoners to other camps. The camp authorities, the capos, and the cooks had fled. On this day, an order was given that the camp must be evacuated completely by sunset. Even the few remaining prisoners, the sick, a few doctors, and some nurses would have to leave. At night, the camp was to be set on fire. In the afternoon, the trucks which were to collect the sick had not yet appeared. Instead, the camp gates were suddenly closed and the barbed wire closely watched so that no one could attempt an escape. The remaining prisoners seemed to be destined to burn with the camp. For the second time, my friend and I decided to escape. We had been given an order to bury three men outside the barbed wire fence. We were the only two in camp who had strength enough to do the job. Nearly all others lay in the few huts which were still in use, prostrate with fever and delirium. We now made our plans. Along with the first body, we would smuggle out my friend's rucksack, hiding it in the old laundry tub, which served as a coffin. When we took out the second body, we would also carry out my rucksack, and on the third trip, we intended to make our escape. The first two trips went according to plan. After we returned, I waited while my friend tried to find a piece of bread so that we could have something to eat during the next few days in the woods. I waited. Minutes passed. I became more and more impatient as he did not return. After 3 years of imprisonment, I was picturing freedom joyously, imagining how wonderful it would be to run toward the battlefront. But we did not get that far. The very moment when my friend came back, the camp gate was thrown open. A splendid aluminium colored car on which were painted large red crosses slowly rolled onto the parade ground. A delegate from the International Red Cross in Geneva had arrived, and the camp and its inmates were under his protection. The delegate billeted himself in the farmhouse in the vicinity in order to be near the camp at all times in case of emergency. Who worried about escape now? Boxes with medicines were unloaded from the car. Cigarettes were distributed. We were photographed, and joy reigned supreme. Now there was no need for us to risk running toward the fighting line. In our excitement, we had forgotten the third board, so we carried it outside and dropped it into the narrow grave we had dug for the three corpses. The guard who accompanied us, a relatively inoffensive man, suddenly became quite gentle. He saw that the tables might be turned and tried to win our goodwill. He joined in the short prayers that we offered for the dead men before throwing soil over them. After the tension and excitement of the past days and hours, those last days in our race with death, the words of our prayer asking for peace were as fervent as any ever uttered by the human voice. And so the last day in camp passed in anticipation of freedom. But we had rejoiced too early. The Red, the Red Cross delegate had assured us that an agreement had been signed and that the camp must not be evacuated. But that night the SS arrived with trucks and brought an order to clear the camp. The last remaining prisoners were to be taken to a central camp from which they would be sent to Switzerland within 48 hours to be exchanged for some prisoners of war. We scarcely recognized the SS. They were so friendly, trying to persuade us to get in the trucks without fear, telling us that we should be grateful for our good luck. Those who were strong enough crowded into the trucks, and the seriously ill and feeble were lifted up with difficulty. My friend and I, we did not hide our rucksacks now, stood in the last row, from which 13 would be chosen for the next to last truck. The chief doctor counted out the requisite number, but he omitted the two of us. The 13 were loaded into the truck, and we had to stay behind, surprised, very annoyed and disappointed. We blamed the chief doctor, who excused himself by saying that he had been tired and distracted. He said that he had thought we still intended to escape impatiently. We sat down, keeping our rucksacks on our backs, and waited with few remaining prisoners for the last truck. We had to wait a long time. Finally, we lay down on the mattresses of the deserted guard room, exhausted by the excitement of the last few hours and days, during which we had fluctuated continually between hope and despair. We slept in our clothes, shoes, and ready for the journey. The noise of rifles and cannons woke us. The flashes of the tracer bullets and gunshots entered the hall. The chief doctor dashed in and ordered us to take cover on the floor. One prisoner jumped on my stomach from the bed above me and with his shoes on. That awakened me all right. Then we grasped what was happening. The battlefront had reached us. The shooting decreased and morning dawned. Outside on the pole at the camp gate, a white flag floated in the wind. Many weeks later, we found that even in those last hours, fate had toyed with us, a few remaining prisoners. We found out just how uncertain human decisions are, especially in matters of life and death. I was confronted with photographs which had been taken in a small camp not far from Mars. Our friends who had thought they were traveling to freedom that night had been taken in the trucks to this camp, and there they were locked in the huts and burned to death. Their partially charred bodies were recognizable on the photograph. I thought again of death in Tehran. Apart from its role as a defensive mechanism, the prisoner's apathy was also the result of other factors. Hunger and lack of sleep contributed to it, as they do in normal life also, and to the general irritability, which was another characteristic of the prisoner's mental state. The lack of sleep was due partly to the pestering of vermin which infested the terribly overcrowded herds because of the general lack of hygiene and sanitation. The fact that we had neither nicotine nor caffeine also contributed to the state of apathy and irritability. Besides these physical causes, there were mental ones in the form of certain complexes. The majority of prisoners suffered from a kind of inferiority complex. We had once been or had fancied ourselves to be somebody. Now we were treated like complete non-entities. The consciousness of one's inner value is anchored in higher, more spiritual things and cannot be shaken by camp life. But how many free men, let alone prisoners, possess it? Without consciously thinking about it, the average prisoner felt himself utterly degraded. This because obvious when one observed the contrast offered by the singular sociological structure of the camp. The more prominent prisoners, the capos, the cooks, the storekeepers, and the camp policemen did not, as a rule, feel degraded at all, like the majority of prisoners, but on the contrary promoted. Some even developed miniature delusions of grandeur. The mental reactions of the envious and grumbling majority toward this favored minority found expression in several ways, sometimes in jokes. For instance, I had one prisoner talk to another about a capo, saying, "Imagine I knew that man when he was only the president of a large bank. Isn't it fortunate that he has risen so far in the world?" Whenever the degraded majority and the promoted minority came into conflict, and there were plenty of opportunities for this, starting with the distribution of food, the results were explosive. Therefore, the general irritability, whose physical causes were discussed above, became most intense when these mental tensions were added. It is not surprising that this tension often ended in a general fight, since the prisoner continually witnessed scenes of beatings. The impulse toward violence was increased. I myself felt my fist clench when anger came over me while I was famished and tired. I was usually very tired since we had to stoke our stove, which we were allowed to keep in our hut for the typhus patient. Throughout the nights, however, some of the most idyllic hours I have ever spent were in the middle of the night when all the others were delirious or sleeping. I could lie stretched out in front of the stove and roast a few pilfered potatoes in a fire made from stolen charcoal. But the following day I always felt even more tired, insensitive, and irritable. While I was working as a doctor in the typhus block, I also had to take the place of the senior block warden who was ill. Therefore, I was responsible to the camp authority for keeping the hut clean, if clean can be used to describe such a condition. The pretense at inspection to which the hut was frequently submitted was more for the purpose of torture than of hygiene. More food and a few drugs would have helped, but the only concern of the inspector was whether a piece of straw was left in the center corridor, or whether the dirty, ragged, and verminous blankets of the patients were tucked in neatly at their feet. As to the fate of the inmates, they were quite unconcerned. If I reported smartly, whipping my prison cap from my shorn head and clicking my heels, hurt number 6, 9, 52 patients, two nursing orderlies, and one doctor, they were satisfied, and then they would leave. But until they arrived, often they were hours later than announced, and sometimes did not come at all. I was forced to keep straightening blankets, picking up bits of straws which fell from the bunks, and shouting at the poor devils who tossed in their bodies and threatened to upset all my efforts at tidiness and cleanliness. Apathy was particularly increased among the feverish patients, so that they did not react at all unless they were shouted at. Even this failed at times, and then it took tremendous self control not to strike them. for one's own irritability took on enormous proportion in the face of others' apathy, and especially in the face of the danger, that is, the approaching inspection, which was caused by it. In attempting this psychological presentation and a psychopathological explanation of the typical characteristics of a concentration camp inmate, I may give this impression that human being is completely and unavoidably influenced by his surroundings. In this case, the surrounding being the unique structure of camp life, which forced the prisoners to conform his conduct to a certain set pattern. But what about human liberty? Is there no spiritual freedom in regard to behavior and reaction to any given surroundings? Is that theory true, which would have us believe that man is no more than a product of many conditional and environmental factors, be they of a biological, psychological, or sociological nature? Is man but an accidental product of these? Most important, do the prisoner's reaction to the singular world of the concentration camp prove that man cannot escape the influences of his surroundings? Does man have no choice of action in the face of such circumstances? We can answer these questions from experience as well as on principle. The experiences of camp life show that man does have a choice of action. There were enough examples, often of a heroic nature, which proved that apathy could be overcome, irritability suppressed. Men can preserve a vestige of spiritual freedom, of independence of mind, even in such terrible condition of psychic and physical stress. We who lived in concentration camp can remember the men who walked through the hearts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And there were always choices to make. Every day, every hour offered the opportunity to make a decision which determined whether you would or would not submit to those powers which threatened to rob you of yourself, your inner freedom, which determined whether or not you would become the plaything of circumstance, renouncing freedom and dignity to become molded into the form of the typical enemy. Seen from this point of view, the mental reactions of the inmates of a concentration camp must seem more to us than the mere expression of certain physical and sociological conditions. Even though conditions such as lack of sleep, insufficient food, and various mental stresses may suggest that the inmates were bound to react in certain ways. In the final analysis, it becomes clear that the sort of person the prisoner became was the result of an inner decision and not the result of camp influences alone. Fundamentally, therefore, any man can, even under such circumstances, decide what shall become of him, mentally and spiritually. He may retain his human dignity even in a concentration camp. Dostoevsky said once, "There's only one thing that I dread, not to be worthy of my sufferings." These words frequently came to my mind after I became acquainted with those martyrs whose behavior in camp, whose suffering and death bore witness to the fact that the last inner freedom cannot be lost. It can be said they were worthy of their sufferings. The way they bore their suffering was a genuine inner achievement. It is this spiritual freedom which cannot be taken away that makes life meaningful and purposeful. An active life serves the purpose of giving man the opportunity to realize values in creative work, while a passive life of enjoyment affords him the opportunity to obtain fulfillment in experiencing beauty, art, or nature. But there is also purpose in that life which is almost barren of both creation and enjoyment and which admits of but one possibility of high moral behavior, namely in man's attitude to his existence, an existence restricted by external forces. A creative life and a life of enjoyment are bound to him. But not only creativeness and enjoyment are meaningful. If there is a meaning in life at all, then there must be a meaning in suffering. Suffering is an ineradicable part of life. even as fate and death. Without suffering and death, human life cannot be complete. The way in which a man accepts his fate and all the sufferings it entails, the way in which he takes up his cross gives him ample opportunity, even under the most difficult circumstances. To add a deeper meaning to this life, it may remain brave, dignified, and unselfish, or in the bitter fight for self preservation, he may forget his human dignity and become no more than an animal. Here lies the chance for a man either to take use of or to forego the opportunities of attaining the moral values that a difficult situation may afford him, and this decides whether he is worthy of his suffering or not. Do not think that these considerations are unworldly and too far removed from real life. It is true that only a few people are capable of reaching such high moral standards. Of the prisoners, only a few kept their full inner liberty and obtained those values which their sufferings afforded. But even one such example is sufficient proof that man's inner strength may raise him above his outward fate. Such men are not only in concentration camps. Everywhere man is confronted with fate with the chance of achieving something through his own suffering. Take the fate of the sick, especially those who are incurable. I once read a letter written by a young invalid in which he told a friend that he had just found out that he would not live for long, that even an operation would be of no help. He wrote further that he remembered a film he had seen in which a man was portrayed who waited for death in a courageous and dignified way. The boy had thought it a great accomplishment to meet death so well. Now he wrote, fate was offering him a similar chance. Those of us who saw the film called Resurrection, taken from a book of Tolstoy years ago, may have had similar thoughts. Here were great destinies and great men. For us at that time, there was no great fate. There was no chance to achieve such greatness. After the picture, we went to the nearest cafe and over a cup of coffee and a sandwich, we forgot the strange metaphysical thoughts which for one moment had crossed our minds. But when we ourselves were confronted with a great destiny and faced with the decision of meeting it with equal spiritual greatness, by then we had forgotten our youthful resolutions of long ago and we failed. Perhaps there came a day for some of us when we saw the same film again or a similar one, but by then other pictures may have simultaneously unrolled before one's inner eye, picture of peoples who attain much more in their lives than a sentimental film could show. Some details of a particular man's inner greatness may have come to one's mind, like the story of the young woman whose death I witnessed in a concentration camp. It is a simple story, there's little to tell, and it may sound as if I had invented it, but to me it seems like a poem. This young woman knew that she would die in the next few days, but when I talked to her, she was cheerful in spite of his knowledge. In spite of this knowledge, I am grateful that fate has hit me so hard, she told me. In my former life, I was spoiled and did not take spiritual accomplishments seriously. Pointing through the window of the heart, she said, this tree here is the only friend I have in my loneliness. Through that window she could see just one branch of a chestnut tree, and on the branch were two blossoms. I often talk to this tree, she said to me. I was startled, and I didn't quite know how to take her words. Was she delirious? Did she have occasional hallucinations? Anxiously I asked her if the tree replied, yes. What did it say to her? She answered, it said to me, I'm here, I'm here, I'm life, eternal life. So, thank you everyone. I hope you enjoyed this section. It was really beautiful, and the author is really writing so well here. And I really love this part actually. And thank you so much for continuing and stay tuned